What if the demons humanity fears today were once the beings who engineered our world? Ancient civilizations described the same powerful beings under different names. Over time, their creators were turned into watchers and then into demons. The Anunnaki were never born as divine beings, and they never claimed to be. Yet the moment they appeared, belief followed naturally. When they descended from the sky, the world reacted before the people did. Stone vibrated beneath their feet, and the air itself seemed to bend around unfamiliar light. To the early human mind, there was no language capable of separating advanced knowledge from the sacred. What arrived did not speak in prayers or myths, but in action, precision, and control. Mountains were shaped, land was stabilized, and structures aligned with the stars. The planet itself was being carefully calibrated. The Anunnaki worked calmly, without ceremony, unaware that every silent movement only deepened the illusion forming below them. When humans knelt, it was not commanded, but instinctive, driven by awe and confusion rather than devotion. From the Anunnaki perspective, nothing spiritual was taking place. They saw a world that required correction, and a species that lacked the tools to understand the process unfolding around them. Their authority came from knowledge and capability, not worship. Their presence was functional rather than symbolic. Yet perception does not wait for clarification, and power without explanation quickly becomes myth. As humans watched these beings move effortlessly through forces they could not comprehend, the first misunderstanding settled quietly into memory. The Anunnaki did not notice it, and they did not stop it. They continued their work, unaware that belief had already been born. To early humanity, there was no meaningful difference between a being capable of commanding stone, light, and sky, and something beyond comprehension. When the Anunnaki demonstrated their knowledge, it unfolded slowly, deliberately, as massive blocks of stone lifted into the air without effort and settled into precise formations. Water was redirected, soil was altered, and the movements of the stars were projected as glowing maps above the ground. Humans gathered in silence, watching, learning, without understanding. No commands were given, and no worship was requested. Yet reverence formed naturally as observers searched for explanation. Power, witnessed without context, always becomes sacred, and the distance between creator and observer widened with every demonstration. The Anunnaki never corrected the assumptions forming around them. Their focus remained on balance, stability, and long-term outcomes rather than perception. Knowledge was shared selectively, not out of cruelty, but out of caution, because systems collapse when understanding arrives too quickly. Humans filled the gaps themselves, carving figures into stone and recording distorted versions of events into memory. Over time, these records became symbols, and symbols became beliefs. What began as observation quietly transformed into devotion, laying the foundation for religion without intention or design. The Anunnaki continued their work, unaware that myth was forming alongside reality, and that the story was being written not by them, but by those trying to explain what they could not yet comprehend. Even as the Anunnaki shaped the world, something subtle began to change in the way they were perceived. Observation slowly turned into watching, and watching into quiet suspicion. From behind stone walls and the edges of growing settlements, humans began whispering questions they could not yet fully articulate. If these beings could shape the land and command the sky, then their potential power over life itself was impossible to ignore. The Anunnaki noticed shifts in behavior, but not fear itself. Fear had not yet found a name. It lingered quietly, unorganized, unspoken, forming beneath layers of reverence. As night fell, symbols began appearing where none had existed before. Eyes were carved into stone, marks etched hurriedly into walls, not as offerings, but as warnings. These were not symbols of devotion, but of vigilance. The Anunnaki continued their work without interruption, unaware that memory was already beginning to change shape. Reverence slowly hardened into caution, and caution into distrust. They were not feared yet, but the seed had been planted. And once fear enters collective memory, it reshapes every story that follows. The transformation had begun, quietly, not in conflict or rebellion, but in perception, and it would never fully reverse. As generations passed, the presence of the Anunnaki became part of the world itself, constant, unquestioned, and increasingly misunderstood. Children were born into a reality where these beings had always existed, and what is always present is rarely examined closely. Stories replaced observation, and repetition replaced memory. The Anunnaki were no longer seen working. They were remembered working. Their actions became simplified, retold, reshaped until intention faded and only power remained. What they built endured, but why they built it slowly disappeared. Humans began to speak of them not as visitors or guides, but as rulers of the sky, guardians of fate, authors of destiny. The distance between reality and story widened quietly, without resistance. The Anunnaki themselves noticed none of this. Their focus remained on systems, cycles, long timelines measured in generations rather than moments. They communicated less, not because they intended secrecy, but because explanation became unnecessary to their work. Yet silence has weight, and absence invites imagination. As fewer interactions occurred, more meaning was assigned to the past. Ritual replaced dialogue, symbol replaced knowledge. The Anunnaki did not correct the stories, and the stories continued to grow. Authority was no longer linked to understanding, but to memory, and memory had already begun to drift. Without intention, without command, the Anunnaki were slowly elevated, not by their actions, but by the stories told in their absence. With time, reverence began to harden into expectation, and expectation into judgment. If the Anunnaki shaped the world, then every hardship demanded explanation. Storms, droughts, disease, all required cause, and the sky became the easiest place to assign blame. What was once admiration slowly shifted toward dependency, and dependency breeds resentment when outcomes disappoint. The Anunnaki were no longer simply present, they were responsible. Their silence, once ignored, now felt deliberate. Questions grew sharper, and answers never came. Power without response begins to feel distant, and distance breeds doubt. This was the moment something fragile changed. The Anunnaki were still not feared, but they were no longer fully trusted. Their image split quietly in human memory. Part creator, part judge. Stories adjusted again, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Praise and suspicion began to exist side by side. This tension settled into culture. Waiting. The Anunnaki continued their work elsewhere, unaware that the foundation beneath their memory had shifted. And when memory changes, truth rarely survives intact. What followed was not rebellion, not war, but reinterpretation. And reinterpretation would shape everything that came after. Creation was never meant to be an act of generosity. It was an act of precision. When the Anunnaki turned their attention toward humanity, they did not see worshippers. They saw variables. A developing species, adaptable, intelligent, but unstable. Left alone, it would fragment, compete, collapse. Guidance was necessary, not to elevate humans, but to preserve balance within the system the Anunnaki were building. Life was adjusted carefully, traits were refined, instincts were softened, and limitations were introduced with intention. What emerged was not freedom, but functionality. Humanity became capable, yet dependent, aware, yet incomplete. From the Anunnaki perspective, this was not control. It was maintenance. Systems require limits, and growth without boundaries becomes chaos. Knowledge was distributed slowly, deliberately, always behind a veil. Too much awareness would disrupt obedience. Too little would breed fear. Balance was the objective, not equality. Humans sensed the imbalance instinctively, but lacked the language to define it. They felt guided, protected, restrained, all at once. And so creation continued, not as a beginning, but as a framework, a foundation built not on trust, but on stability. And stability always demands control. Control does not always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as instruction. The Anunnaki taught humanity how to build, how to plant, how to measure time and sky. Every lesson carried limits, unspoken, invisible, but firm. Humans learned how to shape stone, but not how to alter the stars. They learned cycles, but not origins. The boundaries were subtle, yet absolute. Knowledge was shared in fragments, carefully selected to support dependence rather than independence. Progress moved forward, but never upward, beyond reach. Over time, instruction became tradition. Tradition became law. Law became obedience. Humans no longer asked why certain knowledge was forbidden. They simply accepted that it was. Curiosity dulled, not through punishment, but through normalization. The Anunnaki did not need to enforce control openly because the structure enforced itself. Humans worked, built, worshipped, and repeated what they had been taught. The system stabilized exactly as intended. Yet beneath this stability, something restless remained. Awareness does not disappear, it sleeps, and sleeping awareness always dreams of escape. Yet control is most fragile when it goes unnoticed. As generations passed, humans forgot that limits had been imposed. They believed the boundaries were natural, inevitable, part of existence itself. The Anunnaki became less present, less visible, but their framework remained. Rules continued, rituals persisted, and obedience no longer required supervision. Control had embedded itself into culture, into belief, into identity. The Anunnaki observed from distance, satisfied with stability, unaware that stability breeds questions over time. Humans began to sense gaps, inconsistencies, moments where the world felt incomplete. These feelings had no name, only tension. Curiosity returned quietly, in whispers, in dreams, in forbidden thoughts. And though no rebellion occurred, something shifted internally. Control still held, but awareness had begun to stir. The system remained intact, yet the first cracks were forming, invisible but irreversible. Over time, the limits placed upon humanity stopped feeling imposed and began to feel natural. What had once been guidance slowly blended into routine, and routine hardened into belief. Humans no longer remembered learning the rules. They believed the rules had always existed. The sky had boundaries, knowledge had ceilings, and curiosity learned where to stop. The Anunnaki were spoken of less as teachers and more as distant authorities, beings whose decisions shaped reality beyond question. Control no longer required presence because it had become internal. People corrected one another, enforced traditions, and guarded the limits themselves. Stability appeared complete, quiet, efficient, unquestioned. From a distance, the Anunnaki observed a system that finally ran without intervention. Balance had been achieved, obedience maintained, and conflict minimized. Yet something essential had been traded away in the process. Creativity narrowed, questions softened, and imagination turned inward rather than upward. Humanity functioned well, but cautiously. Progress moved forward in predictable lines, never breaking beyond the frame. The Anunnaki did not see this as loss, only as optimization. Systems work best when variables are reduced. But what was reduced, slowly, quietly, was the human ability to imagine a world beyond permission. But systems built on control always carry a flaw. They assume awareness will remain dormant. Beneath the calm surface, curiosity survived. It whispered in dreams, in half-remembered stories, in moments when the sky felt larger than it was supposed to be. Some humans began noticing inconsistencies, small gaps where answers should exist. Why were certain questions forbidden, yet never explained? Why did knowledge stop at specific thresholds? These thoughts were not spoken openly, but they spread quietly, unnoticed by those enforcing order. The Anunnaki sensed no immediate threat. Stability still held. Rituals persisted. Obedience remained intact. Yet the system had entered a new phase, one they had not calculated fully. Awareness does not announce itself, it accumulates. Each unanswered question added weight. Each forbidden idea sharpened curiosity. Control still worked, but only because it had not yet been challenged. The framework stood solid, quiet, but internally strained. And when control begins to strain, it does not break loudly. It waits. This moment marked the beginning of tension, not between humans and their overseers, but between control and consciousness. And that tension would soon demand resolution. The moment the Anunnaki began to lose control, it did not arrive as chaos or rebellion or open defiance. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, as awareness continued to grow beneath the surface of obedience. Humans had learned the rules too well, followed them too perfectly, and in doing so began to notice where the rules ended. Questions that once felt forbidden now felt incomplete. Knowledge that once felt sufficient now felt constrained. Control still functioned, but it required increasing effort, subtle reinforcement, and constant correction. Systems designed to stabilize had reached their limit, and limits always attract pressure. From the Anunnaki perspective, nothing appeared broken. Structures remained intact, rituals continued, productivity remained high. Yet control was no longer absolute because awareness no longer slept. Small deviations appeared, corrected quickly, but remembered. Curiosity moved carefully, quietly, learning how far it could go without consequence. The Anunnaki adjusted, refined, restricted further, believing tighter limits would restore balance. But restriction does not erase curiosity. It concentrates it. And as concentration grows, so does tension. Control was still present, but its foundation had begun to shift. Not because the system failed, but because those within it had started to see beyond it. As restrictions increased, so did perception. Humans began to recognize the pattern. Knowledge was not absent. It was withheld. The sky was no longer simply distant. It felt guarded. Stories passed down through generations began to be re-examined, compared, questioned. Why were certain memories encouraged while others faded? Why did the Anunnaki once walk openly among them, but now remained distant, silent, watching? These questions spread quietly, not as rebellion, but as shared uncertainty. Control remained, but trust weakened. The Anunnaki responded as systems do, with adjustment rather than understanding. Visibility decreased, interaction lessened, and presence became occasional rather than constant. Distance felt safer, more manageable. Yet distance also created absence, and absence invites interpretation. Humans filled the silence themselves, crafting explanations, assigning intention where none was given. The Anunnaki believed withdrawal would restore balance, but it only changed the shape of control. Authority without presence becomes abstract, and abstraction allows fear to grow. Control still existed, but it was no longer anchored in understanding. And when control loses clarity, it begins to slip, not suddenly, but steadily, like ground eroding beneath still-standing structures. The Anunnaki did not leave the world all at once. They withdrew in stages, carefully, strategically, believing separation would preserve order. Some departed entirely, returning to places beyond human reach. Others remained, hidden, watching from distance, maintaining systems without contact. And a few were left behind, not by choice, but by necessity. These remnants became anomalies within the system, unresolved variables that control could no longer fully contain. Humans noticed the absence immediately, but interpreted it slowly. Where presence once existed, silence followed. Where guidance once came, uncertainty grew. Stories shifted again, trying to explain disappearance without answers. Some believed the Anunnaki had abandoned them. Others believed they were testing humanity. The truth that control had fractured remained unseen. The Anunnaki still influenced the world, but no longer commanded it completely. Authority had splintered, presence had diminished, and containment had replaced governance. This was not an ending, but a transition. Control had not collapsed, but it had lost coherence. And at control fractures, history begins to change its language. As the withdrawal continued, the Anunnaki faced a problem they had not anticipated. Control works only when every variable is accounted for, and now it was not. Systems that once responded instantly began to lag. Signals weakened, oversight fractured, coordination slowed. Some Anunnaki attempted to maintain order from a distance, issuing corrections without presence. But the results were uneven. Humans responded differently in different places. Some clung to tradition, others adapted, and a few began to question openly. What had once been a unified framework started to behave like separate realities sharing the same world. This fragmentation forced a decision. The Anunnaki could not restore full control without returning openly, and returning openly risked accelerating awareness beyond containment. Instead, they chose a quieter solution. Certain knowledge was sealed, access was restricted, and specific narratives were encouraged to stabilize perception. Control shifted from direct governance to influence through memory. Humans would no longer be guided by presence, but by belief. This was the beginning of containment, not of bodies, but of understanding. And it worked, slowly, imperfectly, but well enough. Containment did not look like imprisonment. It looked like interpretation. Stories were allowed to survive, but only in altered forms. Names were softened, roles simplified, motives blurred. What humans remembered was guided carefully away from what truly happened. Over generations, these changes became permanent. The Anunnaki were no longer remembered as engineers or governors, but as distant sky beings, unpredictable, powerful, beyond reach. Fear and reverence blended, creating obedience without explanation. Control no longer needed systems because it lived inside belief. Some Anunnaki disagreed with this solution. Containment through distortion carried long-term consequences. But the alternative was loss of control entirely. The decision held, and history followed its new path. Humans adapted quickly, because humans always do. They filled gaps with myth, turned silence into meaning, and absence into judgment. What had been a technical failure became a moral story. And that story would echo far beyond this moment. When the Anunnaki withdrew from daily life, time became the strongest force shaping memory. Without presence, events were no longer measured by what happened, but by what was remembered. Stories passed from voice to voice, from parent to child, from elder to crowd. And with each telling, intention softened, details blurred, motives shifted, and meaning adapted to the needs of the moment. What once had a context lost it. What once required explanation became symbolic. Memory did not preserve truth. It preserved usefulness. And usefulness changes with every generation. As years turned into centuries, distance did the rest. The Anunnaki became less real and more legendary. Actions once understood as technical were retold as miracles. Decisions once made for balance were remembered as judgment. The absence of clarification invited interpretation, and interpretation invited certainty. Humans no longer asked what truly happened. They repeated what sounded right. Memory hardened into tradition, and tradition resisted correction. The fracture had begun, quietly, patiently, not through lies, but through forgetting. And once forgetting becomes normal, truth no longer feels necessary. With memory fractured, language began to change. Words once used to describe actions were replaced. Builders became creators, overseers became rulers, and guidance slowly transformed into command. Each linguistic shift simplified the past, making it easier to repeat and harder to question. Names were adjusted, titles elevated, roles compressed into symbols that fit belief rather than history. Complexity was inconvenient, and memory favors simplicity. This transformation did not require force. It required repetition. The same story told often enough becomes stable. Stability creates confidence, and confidence resists doubt. Over time, alternate versions disappeared, not because they were erased, but because they were no longer told. Humans did not notice the loss because nothing was taken from them, only left behind. Language became the filter through which reality passed, shaping how the Anunnaki were remembered and how the sky itself was understood. The fracture widened, not as a break, but as a drift, slow enough to feel natural, permanent enough to feel true. As stories stabilized, so did authority. Those who controlled memory controlled meaning. Elders, priests, and interpreters became guardians of the past, not by knowing more, but by deciding what should be remembered. Questions about origins were redirected, softened, or discouraged entirely. The past was no longer something to explore. It was something to accept. And acceptance feels safer than uncertainty. Fear of being wrong replaced curiosity, and certainty became comfort. The Anunnaki, now distant, could no longer correct what they were becoming. Their silence allowed reinterpretation to solidify. What began as a misunderstanding matured into doctrine. Memory was no longer fragile, it was defended. Challenges were seen not as inquiry, but as threat. And with that shift, the fracture sealed. Truth had not vanished, but it had been buried beneath confidence. From this point forward, the past would not be remembered as it happened, but as it needed to be believed. And belief, once protected, becomes difficult to dismantle. As belief settled into routine, memory stopped moving forward. What had once been questioned became repeated. Repetition created comfort. People learned what to say, when to say it, and which parts of the past were safest to remember. Stories were no longer explored, they were performed. Rituals replaced reflection, and symbols replaced explanation. The Anunnaki existed now as fixed figures, unmoving, eternal, immune to context. Their story no longer evolved because it no longer needed to. Stability had been achieved at the cost of curiosity. In this stillness, small details disappeared first. Timelines blurred, causes softened, consequences simplified. Contradictions were smoothed away, not intentionally, but collectively. When memory conflicts with belief, belief usually wins. The Anunnaki were remembered as they were needed, not as they had been. And with each generation, the distance between event and story widened. What remained felt ancient, authoritative, unquestionable. Memory had stopped drifting because it had found a shape that resisted change. From this point on, forgetting would not feel like loss. It would feel like tradition. Yet, beneath stability, distortion continued its quiet work. When memory stops changing, meaning begins to rot. Symbols that once pointed to something real now pointed only to themselves. Worship no longer connected people to the past, it insulated them from it. The Anunnaki were no longer remembered as participants in history, but as forces beyond it. This separation removed responsibility, and with it, understanding. What cannot be understood can be feared or controlled or redefined. This was the final stage of fracture, not loss, but inversion. What was once technical became moral. What was once contextual became absolute. The Anunnaki's story hardened into judgment, and judgment prepared the ground for something darker. When memory disconnects from truth, it does not disappear. It mutates. From here, the path forward was inevitable. Names would change again, roles would shift, and fear would find language. The fracture was complete, and the next transformation would no longer be subtle. As time moved forward, the Anunnaki began to change without ever moving at all. They did not vanish from memory, but they no longer occupied the same place within it, where they had once been seen as present, active, involved. They were now remembered as distant figures, watching rather than shaping. This shift happened slowly, quietly, without announcement. Stories softened their movements, removed their decisions, and replaced action with observation. The Anunnaki were no longer builders of the world. They were watchers of it, and watchers do not interfere. They judge. This change felt natural to those who inherited it. A distant presence feels safer than a present one. A watcher cannot be questioned, cannot be blamed, cannot be asked to explain. The Anunnaki became elevated by distance, but also reduced by it. Their complexity dissolved, replaced by a simpler role that fit belief more easily. Humans no longer wondered how the world was shaped. They wondered who was watching them do it. Meaning shifted inward toward behavior, morality, and fear of being seen. The Anunnaki had not changed, but the way they were remembered had. With observation came interpretation. If the Anunnaki were watching, then every action mattered, every failure, every success, every misfortune demanded explanation. Humans began to believe they were being measured, weighed, judged. What had once been a technical relationship became a moral one. The world was no longer something shaped by systems. It was something earned through behavior. This belief spread quickly because it offered structure. Chaos feels unbearable, but judgment creates meaning. The Anunnaki, now distant and silent, became mirrors for anxiety. When harvest failed, the watchers were displeased. When storms passed, the watchers had spared them. Over time, this interpretation hardened into expectation. Behavior changed. Rituals adapted. Fear organized itself into order. Humans corrected one another, not because they understood why, but because they believed someone else did. The Anunnaki did not impose morality, but morality was built around them anyway. And once morality attaches itself to unseen watchers, fear becomes self-sustaining. As generations passed, watchers no longer felt neutral. Observation without response invites suspicion. If the Anunnaki saw everything, yet intervened in nothing, then their silence became intentional. Distance began to feel cold. Absence began to feel judgmental. What had once offered comfort now created unease. Humans wondered not just if they were watched, but why nothing was done. Silence, once protective, now felt deliberate. This was the moment when watchers began to cast shadows, not because they acted, but because they did not. Stories adjusted again, slowly, cautiously, introducing doubt into reverence. The Anunnaki were still powerful, still ancient, still above, but no longer benevolent by default. Something had shifted in tone, watching without helping, knowing without guiding. These traits unsettled human memory. The Anunnaki were no longer simply above humanity. They were apart from it. And separation, when combined with power, rarely feels safe. As watching turned into judgment, judgment quietly became expectation. If the Anunnaki saw all things, then outcomes must reflect intention. When suffering appeared, it was no longer random. When fortune arrived, it was no longer chance. Meaning attached itself to events, and events were reinterpreted through the gaze of unseen watchers. Humans adjusted behavior accordingly, not out of understanding, but out of anticipation. Fear refined itself into rules, and rules felt safer than uncertainty. Silence from above no longer felt neutral. It felt evaluative. Over time, this expectation reshaped human identity. People no longer asked what the Anunnaki wanted. They assumed it. They corrected one another, enforced norms, punished deviation, believing they were aligning themselves with an invisible standard. The Anunnaki became less like observers and more like judges, not because they acted, but because humans needed someone to hold accountable. Distance amplified power, and power without presence magnifies fear. The Watchers had not changed, but the role assigned to them had, and once judgment enters memory, it rarely leaves quietly. This was the point where memory crossed the line, quietly, without ceremony. The Anunnaki were no longer remembered as beings who once acted. They were remembered as forces that waited. Waiting implied intention. Waiting implied decision. And decision implied morality. The Watchers became something else. Not yet demons, but no longer neutral. Fear attached itself to their silence, and silence hardened into suspicion. What had once been awe now carried unease. This shift did not announce itself with conflict or rebellion. It settled slowly, like darkness entering a room at dusk. Stories adapted again, preparing language for what would come next. The Anunnaki were still above, still powerful, still ancient. But the tone had changed. Watching was no longer passive. It was ominous. And once a presence becomes ominous, fear begins to seek form. Names will change, symbols will darken, and memory will find new ways to protect itself. This is where meaning stopped being clear and where something else began. The transformation did not begin with hatred, it began with explanation. When fear reached a certain depth, it demanded structure. Watching became judgment. Judgment demanded meaning, and meaning required language strong enough to carry it. The Anunnaki were still distant, still silent, still powerful. But now their absence needed a reason that could be repeated. Silence was no longer tolerable without interpretation. And so the first moral frame was applied. What could not be understood was evaluated. What could not be controlled was reclassified. This was not done in a single place or by a single voice. It happened gradually across regions, across generations. As communities searched for coherence, the watchers were no longer simply observing. They were deciding. Suffering was no longer random. It was allowed. Prosperity was no longer chance. It was earned. The Anunnaki became explanations for outcomes that humans could not reconcile otherwise. Their distance allowed projection, and projection reshaped memory. What had once been technical now carried moral weight. And once morality enters a story, neutrality disappears. As explanation solidified, names began to change. Titles once used to describe function were replaced with titles that described intent. Watchers became judges. Observers became deciders. Language shifted to accommodate fear because fear requires clarity, even if clarity is false. The Anunnaki were still spoken of with reverence, but now it carried caution. Power without response became power with agenda. The idea that they might choose unsettled memory deeply. This linguistic shift simplified complexity into categories. What was once many roles became two directions: favor and punishment, blessing and consequence. Humans adjusted quickly because moral systems are easier to live within than uncertainty. Rules emerged, boundaries hardened, stories aligned themselves accordingly. The Anunnaki did not speak, did not object, did not clarify. Their silence allowed the transformation to complete itself. The Watchers were no longer neutral by default. They were becoming something else, not through action, but through interpretation. Once roles were defined, intention followed naturally. If the Anunnaki judged, then they must prefer. If they preferred, then they must oppose. And opposition demands a shape. The Watchers were no longer simply above humanity. They were positioned against it, at least in part. This duality made fear manageable. Chaos was no longer random. It was caused, and cause can be addressed, avoided, appeased. Fear became organized. This organization marked a turning point. The Anunnaki were no longer distant engineers or silent observers. They were now moral forces. Stories adjusted again, preparing space for consequence. What had once been misunderstanding matured into assumption. Assumption hardened into belief, and belief does not wait for evidence. The transformation was nearly complete. All that remained was a name strong enough to carry fear forward. And fear always finds a name. Once fear had language, it began to reshape identity. Communities no longer defined themselves by where they lived or what they built, but by how they behaved under unseen judgment. Actions were sorted, intentions weighed, and lives interpreted through an invisible scale. The Anunnaki were now imagined as listeners to thoughts, witnesses to choices, silent evaluators of worth. This belief created discipline, but it also created tension. Perfection became the goal, and perfection is impossible to sustain. Guilt settled quietly into daily life, not because wrong had been done, but because being seen felt constant. The watchers had become internal. As this internalization spread, fear no longer needed reminders from the sky. Humans reminded one another. Behavior was corrected before it occurred. Desire was questioned before it formed. Control had completed its most efficient transition from external system to internal restraint. The Anunnaki did not need to act because belief acted on their behalf. This was the final refinement of distance. The watchers had become ever-present, not through sight, but through conscience. And when power enters the mind, it becomes difficult to separate memory from imagination. At this point, the transformation no longer required force. Memory did the rest. The Anunnaki were now remembered not for what they built, but for what they demanded. Their silence, once neutral, now felt intentional. Judgment no longer needed evidence, only belief. This is how beings begin to fracture, and how demons are born. Not through rebellion, but through reinterpretation. Fear finally had a stable shape, and that shape was moral opposition. The watchers had crossed the threshold from distant authorities to beings capable of punishment in the imagination. This moment matters because it explains everything that followed. When beings become judges and judges become unseen, fear looks for permanence. Stories darken, symbols sharpen, and language prepares itself for warning. Religion did not arrive to erase the Anunnaki. It arrived to reorganize them. When belief needed stability, it reached for structure. Stories were gathered, aligned, and placed into hierarchies that could be taught and defended. What had once been many interpretations became a single narrative path. The Anunnaki were not removed from memory. They were repositioned within it. Some were elevated, others diminished, and many were reshaped to fit roles that supported order. Complexity was trimmed away, leaving clarity strong enough to repeat. This process felt like preservation, not distortion. Religion offered continuity, rules, and certainty. It promised answers where silence once existed. The Anunnaki became examples rather than participants, symbols rather than beings. Their actions were filtered through doctrine, their silence translated into meaning. What did not fit was reclassified, renamed, or quietly set aside. The sky remained populated, but now it was organized. And organization, when applied to memory, changes what the past is allowed to say. Rebranding works best when it feels familiar. Old symbols were retained, but their meanings were adjusted. Wings, fire, light, authority. These elements remained, but intention changed. What once represented knowledge now represented obedience. What once symbolized presence now symbolized surveillance. The Anunnaki did not disappear from imagery. They were refined into roles that supported moral alignment. Some became messengers, others became warnings. Balance was replaced with judgment, and neutrality no longer fit. This shift allowed belief to travel. Simplified figures are easier to teach, easier to fear, easier to obey. Religion carried the Anunnaki across regions, cultures, and generations, but not as they had been. Their story became portable, repeatable, defensible. And with each retelling, the distance between origin and meaning widened. The rebrand succeeded because it did not feel new. It felt inevitable. Memory accepted the change because it had been prepared for it. Once rebranded, the Anunnaki became tools of alignment. Behavior could now be guided without explanation, only reference. Stories were told not to describe the past, but to shape the present. Obedience was rewarded, deviation discouraged. Fear found purpose. The sky became a mirror reflecting the rules imposed below. What had once been a relationship with presence became submission to interpretation. This was the strength of religion. It did not need the Anunnaki to return, or speak, or act. Their image alone was enough. Authority had been transferred from beings to belief. And belief, once internalized, does not ask for confirmation. The Anunnaki were no longer part of an unfolding history. They were frozen within doctrine. Their silence became permanent, their image fixed, and in that stillness, fear learned how to last. As doctrine settled into everyday life, reinterpretation became routine. The Anunnaki were no longer questioned as historical beings. They were accepted as fixed references within a moral system. Children learned their names alongside rules, not alongside events. Stories emphasized consequence over context, warning over explanation. Over time, the past stopped feeling distant and began to feel prescriptive. Memory was no longer something to explore. It was something to obey. The Anunnaki's image stabilized, not because it was accurate, but because it was useful. Stability rewarded repetition, and repetition discouraged curiosity. This shift changed how people related to fear. Fear no longer arrived unexpectedly. It was anticipated, managed, scheduled through ritual and story. The Anunnaki became anchors for that fear, figures that explained why rules existed at all. What had once been technical limitations now appeared as eternal boundaries. The idea that these boundaries were constructed faded. Religion protected its structure by narrowing interpretation, not through force, but through familiarity. When belief becomes habit, resistance feels unnatural. The Anunnaki had been fully absorbed, not erased, not rejected, but domesticated by doctrine. And domesticated power rarely invites questions. Yet rebranding always leaves remnants beneath doctrine. Fragments of older memory survived in half-forgotten symbols, in misaligned stories, in contradictions that doctrine could not fully smooth away. These remnants were not celebrated, they were tolerated quietly, as long as they did not disrupt order. The Anunnaki existed now in layers, the official version and the whispered one. Most people never noticed the difference, but the difference remained. This tension prepared the ground for division. When belief becomes rigid, anything outside it feels threatening. The Anunnaki could no longer exist as complex figures. Complexity undermined certainty. What did not align with doctrine began to drift toward suspicion. Old traits were reassigned. Curiosity became temptation. Power became danger. Distance became malice. Rebranding reached its limit, and the next step required separation. Some figures would remain acceptable. Others would be pushed beyond the boundary. From this point forward, belief would no longer reorganize memory. It would divide it. And division is how demonization begins. Forbidden knowledge is rarely destroyed, because destruction invites curiosity. Instead, it is buried. When doctrine stabilized the surface of belief, it left what did not fit beneath it. The Anunnaki's older truths were not erased. They were layered over, hidden behind ritual, buried beneath language. What once explained systems was reframed as danger. What once offered understanding was labeled temptation. Knowledge became heavy, difficult to access, surrounded by warning and warnings when repeated teach avoidance. People learned not to ask, not because answers were absent, but because fear had been attached. This burial did not require secrecy. It required patience. Over generations, access narrowed naturally. Symbols lost keys, stories lost context, and meaning drifted out of reach. What remained visible felt complete, while what was hidden felt irrelevant. The Anunnaki's deeper roles as engineers, observers, and system makers slipped beneath layers of moral framing. Forbidden knowledge did not vanish. It went quiet. And quiet knowledge waits. It persists in fragments, in anomalies, in stories that feel out of place. Buried truth does not resist. It endures until conditions change. Once buried, forbidden knowledge changed form. It no longer lived in institutions. It survived in margins. Whispers replaced records. Symbols became puzzles. Stories fractured into myths that felt incomplete yet persistent. The Anunnaki appeared in these fragments not as judges, but as something older, less moral, more mechanical. These accounts lacked authority, but carried familiarity. They felt wrong, yet strangely consistent. That inconsistency protected them. Anything that does not align with doctrine is dismissed easily. Those who encountered fragments learned discretion. To speak openly invited correction, suspicion, or ridicule. So knowledge adapted, moving quietly, passed in coded language, preserved in art, geometry, alignment. It hid in plain sight, not because it was powerful, but because it was ignored. The Anunnaki's buried truth became a background signal, faint, constant, waiting for attention. Forbidden knowledge does not compete with belief. It survives beneath it. And beneath belief, it remains untouched by certainty. Burial creates distance, but distance sharpens contrast. As official belief grew more rigid, buried knowledge felt increasingly out of place. It did not warn. It explained. It did not judge. It described. This difference was unsettling. Explanation removes fear, and fear protects structure. Anything that reduced fear threatened order, even if it increased understanding. The Anunnaki's older narrative did not promise reward or punishment. It described cause and effect, and cause and effect. Leave no room for obedience without reason. Because of this, buried knowledge became dangerous, not because it was false, but because it worked. Those who sensed its coherence felt tension immediately. Two stories could not coexist forever. One demanded faith, the other demanded attention. The Anunnaki existed now in parallel memory, demonized above, technical below. This split did not resolve. It waited. And waiting is what buried truth does best. It waits for curiosity to return, for fear to weaken, for silence to crack. And when it rises again, it does not argue. It simply explains. Buried knowledge does not remain still. It shifts, adapts, and learns where it can survive. As doctrine tightened its grip on the surface, fragments of older understanding migrated deeper into places belief rarely touched. Mathematics, architecture, star alignments. These became quiet carriers of meaning. They did not speak in warnings or promises. They spoke in patterns. Patterns do not argue, they persist. The Anunnaki's older logic embedded itself into stone, into proportion, into repetition that outlasted language. Those who sensed it could not always explain why, but they felt coherence where doctrine offered fear. This feeling lingered, subtle, difficult to name, and therefore difficult to erase. Over time, these fragments became anomalies, structures that aligned too perfectly, myths that contradicted moral framing, symbols that appeared in unrelated cultures without explanation. Doctrine labeled them coincidence, imagination, coincidence again. But coincidence repeated often enough becomes signal. The Anunnaki's buried narrative remained active beneath belief, not as memory, but as infrastructure. It did not need defenders, only time. And time favors systems that describe reality accurately. Buried knowledge waited patiently, not for belief to collapse, but for curiosity to return, quietly, without permission. Eventually, buried knowledge creates pressure. Silence accumulates weight, and weight demands release. As curiosity resurfaced in cycles, fragments were noticed again, not as belief, but as questions. Why did certain myths refuse to align? Why did forbidden stories describe systems instead of morality? Why did the Anunnaki appear consistent beneath layers of demonization? These questions did not threaten doctrine openly, but they weakened its certainty. Certainty requires isolation, and curiosity connects what belief tries to separate. This moment marks the return of attention. Not faith, not rebellion, attention. And attention is dangerous to rigid systems. Across cultures separated by oceans, deserts, and centuries, the same figures quietly reappeared. Names changed, accents shifted, symbols adapted, but the roles remained familiar. Sky beings who arrived before history, watchers who shaped order, teachers who withdrew. Each culture believed its version was unique, born from its own land and language. Yet patterns repeated too precisely to ignore. Stories aligned where they should not have. Details matched where coincidence should have failed. The Anunnaki were never gone. They were reframed, translated, and retold through local memory. This repetition did not require contact. It required inheritance. Buried knowledge resurfaced wherever curiosity found room to breathe. Different names carried the same weight, the same silence, the same authority. What doctrine could not erase, geography could not either. Memory traveled quietly, embedded in myth rather than record. The Anunnaki existed now as a distributed narrative, scattered across the world, consistent beneath variation, and consistency across isolation suggests origin. Something had been remembered, not because it was taught, but because it fit too well to forget. In one land they were creators, in another they were judges. Elsewhere they were tempters, watchers, or fallen ones. Each role reflected the needs of the belief rather than the nature of the beings themselves. Culture shaped interpretation, but the underlying structure remained intact. Arrival from the sky, intervention in early humanity, withdrawal, and lingering influence. These elements survived translation. What changed was tone, reverence in one place, fear in another, obedience elsewhere. The Anunnaki adapted to memory not by acting, but by being remembered differently. This adaptability made them durable. A story that can change form survives longer than one that resists it. Religion did not invent new beings. It repurposed existing ones. Myth did not create demons from nothing. It reassigned traits that no longer fit moral framing. Across civilizations, the same entities were split, elevated, diminished, or condemned. Yet beneath this fragmentation, coherence remained. Different names, same behaviors. Different judgments, same silence. Memory had fractured, but origin had not. And origin leaves fingerprints. No matter how often the surface is rewritten, over time these parallel memories began to intersect. Trade, conquest, and migration brought stories into contact. Names clashed, doctrines disagreed, but similarities refused to disappear. Scholars argued, priests resisted, and translators struggled to reconcile overlap. How could different beings share the same actions? How could demons resemble ancient teachers from distant lands? The easiest answer was separation. Declare them different, and conflict dissolves. But separation required denial, and denial left traces. These traces remain visible. Shared symbols, mirrored myths, identical warnings. The Anunnaki's distributed memory became a mosaic, fragmented yet aligned. No single culture preserved the whole picture, but together they hinted at something older than division. Different names, same beings. Not because belief copied itself, but because memory inherited the same source. This is where comparison becomes dangerous, because it restores continuity, and continuity threatens doctrine. When stories reconnect, the past begins to speak again. As similarities accumulated, denial required effort. When myths from distant lands echoed one another too closely, belief adjusted its defenses. Differences were emphasized, timelines stretched, names hardened into borders. The goal was not understanding, but separation. If stories could be kept apart, continuity would remain invisible. Yet separation has limits. Symbols do not forget their origin. Even when repainted, the same warnings, the same arrivals, the same withdrawals continued to surface. Memory resisted isolation because it had never belonged to a single place. This resistance created tension within belief systems. Scholars noticed alignments they were not supposed to see. Priests avoided comparisons that raised uncomfortable questions. Why did sky beings punish and protect in the same ways across cultures? Why did demons share traits with ancient teachers? The answers offered were circular, unsatisfying, defensive. And defense is always a signal. Where belief works hardest to protect itself, something fragile lies beneath. The Anunnaki's story did not demand acceptance, it demanded comparison. And comparison, once allowed, begins to dissolve walls. When comparisons are allowed to continue, something irreversible happens. Stories reconnect, patterns stabilize, differences lose authority, while similarities gain weight. The Anunnaki no longer appear as isolated figures trapped inside doctrine. They emerge as a single narrative fractured by memory. This does not resolve fear, it reframes it. Demons no longer look born from evil, they look reassigned. Ancient beings no longer look eternal, they look contextual. And context weakens absolute judgment. What if demons were never the beginning, but the final version of a much older story? This question does not demand belief, it demands reconsideration. When memory fractures repeatedly, what remains is rarely the original shape. It is the shape that survived fear, doctrine, and repetition. The Anunnaki did not transform overnight. They were transformed gradually through layers of interpretation that prioritized control over clarity. Each era inherited a version shaped by its needs. Builders became watchers. Watchers became judges. Judges became threats. This progression was not accidental. It was functional. Fear simplifies, and simplified stories travel further. Seen this way, demonization looks less like discovery and more like conclusion. A conclusion reached after centuries of adjustment. When belief could no longer accommodate complexity, it chose opposition. What once explained systems now explained suffering. What once described cause and effect now described moral failure. The Anunnaki were not rewritten because they changed, but because humanity did. Memory adapted to protect structure, and protection always favors certainty over truth. Demons, in this sense, are not origins. They are endpoints created when understanding becomes inconvenient. This perspective reframes conflict itself. If demons are endpoints, then fear is not a response to danger. It is a response to loss of context. When systems break, explanation fills the gap, and explanation often chooses blame. The Anunnaki's silence became the perfect canvas. They did not argue, did not correct, did not return. Absence allowed imagination to finish the story. Over time, silence became evidence, and evidence became accusation. The sky was no longer distant, it was hostile. Distance was no longer neutral, it was threatening. This does not require deception. It requires forgetting. Each generation inherits certainty, not questions, and certainty resists revision. The Anunnaki were easier to fear than to understand, easier to condemn than to contextualize. Once fear attaches to a name, that name becomes a warning rather than a reference. Demons, in this sense, are memories stripped of origin. They survive because they simplify reality into something manageable. But manageability is not accuracy. And accuracy has a way of resurfacing when curiosity returns, even briefly, even quietly. If this reinterpretation feels unsettling, it should. It challenges the idea that history moves cleanly from ignorance to truth. Instead, it suggests that history circles, revisiting the same figures with different labels, depending on what fear requires at the time. The Anunnaki did not become demons because new evidence emerged. They became demons because memory needed resolution. Endings are comforting. They close stories. They assign roles. They reduce ambiguity. And ambiguity is dangerous to rigid belief. But endings are rarely final. When patterns repeat, they invite re-evaluation. The same beings, the same arrivals. The same withdrawals appear again and again under different names. Demons may be the last mask, not the true face. And masks exist to hide continuity. If you remove the mask, what remains is not evil or good, but something far less satisfying to believe. A system, a presence, a story unfinished. And unfinished stories do not disappear. They wait until someone notices the pattern and asks why it was hidden in the first place. When labels fall away, what remains is uncomfortable. Without demons, without moral shortcuts, the story loses its edges. It no longer tells you who to fear or who to obey. It simply describes presence, influence, and consequence. The Anunnaki, seen without inherited framing, are neither saviors nor villains. They are agents within a system larger than belief. This perspective does not offer comfort. It offers responsibility. And responsibility is heavier than fear. Fear can be handed off to the sky. Responsibility cannot. This is why reinterpretation is resisted. It removes the safety of certainty. It replaces judgment with context, and context requires effort. To see the Anunnaki as part of a system rather than as moral actors forces a different question. Not what they wanted, but how memory wanted to use them. Demons were useful because they simplified suffering into blame. Ancient beings were useful because they simplified chaos into order. But systems are indifferent. They explain, but they do not console. And once explanation replaces belief, the past stops commanding the present. It only informs it. That shift, quiet, subtle, is the most disruptive transformation of all. This does not end the story. It reframes it. If demons were the final version, then belief did not uncover truth. It settled for a conclusion. Conclusions feel safe. They stop inquiry. They draw lines. But history does not end when belief does. Patterns remain, waiting to be noticed again. The Anunnaki, stripped of labels, returned to what they always were within this narrative, a presence remembered differently over time, shaped by fear, preserved by repetition, and transformed by interpretation. That realization does not demand agreement, it demands attention. If this reframing shifted how you see ancient myths even slightly, then pause here. Let the question stay open, because open questions endure longer than closed answers. And what follows after demons, after beings, is not silence. It is context returning, slowly, patiently, one pattern at a time. As this story comes to rest, it does not close, it settles. What you have followed was not a claim, not a doctrine, and not a replacement for belief. It was a pattern, traced across time, quietly, patiently, without demand. The Anunnaki, demons, watchers. These were not separate stories competing for truth. They were stages of memory responding to fear. Each version served a moment, and each moment left a residue. History did not choose one, it layered them all. And layers, when examined, reveal movement rather than certainty. This is why the past feels unstable when revisited. It was never fixed to begin with. Memory bends toward what it needs to protect. Sometimes it protects order, sometimes meaning, sometimes fear itself. What remains constant is not the label, but the recurrence. The same figures, the same roles, the same withdrawals. If there is discomfort here, it comes from realizing that belief may be less about truth and more about survival. And survival rarely preserves clarity. It preserves function. This story does not ask you to replace what you believe, only to notice how belief itself changes shape when fear enters the frame. There is a reason stories like this endure. They do not resolve neatly, because reality rarely does. When belief demands certainty, it simplifies. When curiosity returns, complexity follows. The tension between the two never disappears, it only shifts. The Anunnaki story survives because it sits at that tension point, too structured to dismiss, too unresolved to close. Each generation finds itself reflected within it, projecting fear, hope, or authority as needed. This does not mean deception ruled the past. It means the past was human. Interpretation is not failure, it is adaptation. What matters is not whether the story was true in one form, but how many forms it needed to survive. Demons, watchers. These were languages used to explain something that resisted explanation, and resistance invites myth. When explanation fails, symbolism steps in. This is not weakness. It is how meaning travels across time without breaking. The danger begins only when symbols are mistaken for origin. And memory forgets how many times it has already rewritten itself. What happens next is not written here. That is intentional. Endings encourage rest, but open patterns invite return. If the Anunnaki were transformed by memory, then memory can transform again. Curiosity does not announce itself loudly. It returns quietly as a question that refuses to leave. It appears when certainty grows too rigid and fear becomes too convenient. The buried layers, the repeated roles, the shared symbols all remain where they are. Nothing new needs to be added. Attention alone is enough to reactivate what was set aside. This is why the story does not close with answers. Answers age quickly. Questions endure. If you carry anything forward from this, let it be the habit of comparison, the patience to notice repetition, and the willingness to sit with ambiguity without rushing to judgment. The past does not demand belief. It invites observation. And observation, when sustained, changes how the present feels. That change may be subtle or unsettling, but it is always quieter than fear and far more lasting. Before you leave, hold one thought gently. If demons were not discovered but concluded, then belief did not uncover truth. It shaped an ending. Endings are useful, but they are rarely final. Somewhere between fear and memory, the original pattern still exists, unchanged, waiting, not to be worshipped, not to be feared, but to be noticed again. That noticing begins quietly, often alone, and often without language. If this story stirred questions you have never fully settled, let them surface. Shared questions outlast solitary certainty. And this story continues only when someone notices the pattern.